All right, so in this video, we're going to continue going through a discussion of North America in time period 5. We may also dip into a little bit of South America too. But most of our discussion here is going to be in North America, kind of continuing what we had been doing in the video prior to this one in looking at American expansion as an empire. So we're going to keep thinking about American empire building, which at the time is not really all that different from what other industrial powers are doing. So this is not really any different than what the Europeans are doing. The British are doing this in India. The Europeans are doing this throughout Africa. The Japanese are getting involved in this. So this is not an uncommon occurrence, and the Americans are simply doing it in North America. So in the last video, we looked at how the Americans dealt with the Canadians and how the Americans dealt with Native Americans. We're going to do one more encounter with another nation, and that's the Mexicans. So the Mexicans became independent in 1821. But unlike the United States, the leaders of Mexico did not seem willing or able to keep to their constitutions. And so what we see in Mexico is a rule of people who are called caudillos. And caudillos are basically military leaders. So caudillos are going to be seen in Mexico and throughout Latin America as pretty much military dictators. Now, as the Americans moved west, they encountered the Mexicans, who were their neighbors to the southwest. And in 1846, after a Mexican military incursion, so the Mexicans attacked Americans, the United States invaded and pretty quickly defeated the Mexicans. And in the resulting treaty, called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States paid Mexico roughly about $15 million at the time for what is now the American Southwest. And this just adds to the idea of manifest destiny, that the United States was destined to control all of North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, to kind of wrap up what's been going on in Mexico, this was a harsh wake-up call to the Mexicans. And they decide they need to modernize. And so they take out loans from Europeans, the Spanish, the British, and the French primarily. In the 1850s, Mexico was hit by economic problems. And Mexico couldn't pay the loans back. And so this, coupled with internal political issues that we don't really need to worry about, really crippled the Mexican economy. And it got to be so bad that in 1862, France invaded Mexico to get their money back. And they actually set up a French-backed Austrian monarch as the new Emperor of Mexico. And you might be wondering, well, why is the United States not doing anything about this? They surely aren't happy that the French are setting up a puppet state in Mexico. And you've got to remember that this is happening during the American Civil War. So the Americans are occupied at the time, and the French were able to kind of sneak in under the radar. As soon as the war was over, though, the United States tells France to get going, and they do in 1867. And the poor Emperor of Mexico gets executed. But this is pretty typical of what's going on in Mexico. The next 50 years of Mexican history is marked by military leaders and a lack of political freedom. But they do modernize. But that was mainly a way to extract natural resources for the United States and Europeans. Mainly things like oil. All right, so we've kind of now talked about how the Americans built their empire. The last topic that I want to talk about here in terms of what's going on in the Western Hemisphere are these I guess we'll just call them American societies. Now, these American societies are marked by being multicultural. And what we'll notice is that there is a struggle or a conflict between what I'm going to call cultural diversity and cultural adhesion, like sticking together. So, what do I mean by this struggle? What we're going to notice is that as more different types of people are present in these societies, the definition of who belongs changes and adapts. So, for instance, I'm going to give you one example of this from the United States, but I really want to spend most of the time here talking about Canada and Latin America. But for instance, in the 1840s, a lot of Irish people migrated to the United States and Canada. And this was a result of the potato famine. And the Irish were discriminated against. They were different. They were mostly Catholic and the US was mostly Protestant. If we jump ahead to the 1880s, a lot of Chinese people migrated to the United States and Canada. For various reasons that we'll get to when we start talking about China in time period 5. But at this point, the Irish had more or less assimilated, and they discriminated against the Chinese. So over this 40-year period, who was considered an American changed. The Irish, who used to be discriminated against, are now the ones doing the discriminating. So there's this idea that these are very diverse societies, but the people who are in those societies get to decide who is in the in group and who is in the out group. So in group versus out group. The in group is in, the out group is out. We want the people in the in group to stay. We want people in the out group to go. And over time, these groups change and adapt. So one place that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is Canada, mostly because we've talked a lot about the United States, so it's probably a good idea to talk about Canada a little bit. So Canada was not really any more welcoming to immigrants. So the situation in Canada was very similar to the situation in the United States. There were some conflicts, and there still are. There were some conflicts between English speaking Canadians and French speaking Canadians. There were also conflicts with Native Americans, and here I mean Native North Americans. The Canadians call them the First Peoples because they were there first. And there is another group of people here that we're going to call the Métis, and these are mixed race people in Canada. And they didn't really fit in with any group. These guys, I guess, would correspond to the mestizo people in Spanish colonial society. If we look at what's going on in Latin America, so Mexico and South America, here we see a division between urban and rural societies. And I think the difference here is that here there had always been a multicultural society, and even though it was racist and very hierarchical, they had adapted to it, whereas the Americans were more resistant to that adaptation. So here we see more of a division between urban and rural societies. And over time, the urban societies overwhelmed the rural ones. They were just richer and more advanced. So cities kind of started to dominate the rural areas. And we see this kind of all over, from Mexico all the way down to Argentina. That doesn't mean that there's not still conflicts. Rural peasants often rebelled against urban encroachments. So that's still something that happens today. Now, there is an exception to this, and this would be Gaucho society. So, Gaucho society is a unique South American culture. And it's kind of similar to what we might in the United States think about as like cowboy society. This was really inclusive. Anyone could be a gaucho. They mostly lived as ranchers. So kind of think of them as like nomadic pastoralists. And like nomadic pastoralists, they lived off their own skills. The idea being that being skilled was much more important than being rich or being powerful, because that's how you survived. So we're going to stop there. And from this point, we're now going to go back to the Eastern Hemisphere and look at the empires that are growing and declining in the Eastern Hemisphere. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.